Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Today, as I know, a lot of us are, at the time this video is posted, going to be really getting into garden planning. And one of the first things you want to think about when you're planning your garden for the year is what varieties you're going to grow. You know, it's time to order seeds at the time you'll be seeing this video. I'm actually filming this video in October because I wanted to take advantage of the beautiful weather. I wanted to be able to film this video outside while it's still nice and warm out. You know, you can see I've got my beautiful fall flowers blooming behind me. And most importantly, I like to film this kind of video while the previous year's garden is still fresh in my mind. So today what I'm going to be sharing with you is my absolute must-grow varieties in the garden. Now this is not going to be close to an exhaustive list of what I'm going to be growing this year. You know, I like to add new varieties every year, so I will be growing a lot more than what we'll be talking about today. What I'm really going to be focusing on today is, you know, the must-grows that I make a point to grow every year in the garden. So I'll be trying out lots of new varieties. I have some other varieties that I grow here and there, but today we're going to be talking about, you know, the best of the best in my experience. And as I go through my list, just keep in mind that your list might be completely different. A lot of this can change based on individual growing conditions. A lot of it can change just based on preference. So my list is something to kind of use as a jumping off point. Maybe research these varieties, talk to local gardeners in your area, and find out how well these varieties do for people in your area. Just for reference, I'm growing here in Connecticut. I'm in zone 6, which the zone doesn't matter as much when it comes to annual vegetable gardening. That just gives you a little bit of a reference as to how cold my typical winter will be. So annual vegetables are really widely adaptable and can grow across a really wide array of climates. But as I said, use this list as a jumping off point and connect with local gardeners to find out what works really well for them. So as I go through my list, you'll notice that I'm not sharing something from every category of vegetable. Sometimes that's just because there are certain things that we don't really grow. For example, no one in my family really likes beets, so I don't grow beets. So there aren't going to be any beets on my must-grow list. There are other things that I like to grow, but I maybe don't have a specific go-to variety. In some cases, I'm still really searching for the right variety. In other cases, I just kind of mix it up every year because I don't have a certain variety that I'm really attached to. So I'm just going to go through this list. I'm sure there will be stuff missing. If there are any varieties missing from this list, any categories, feel free to, in the comments, leave your go-to varieties. Even for the categories that I'm including here, I'm always looking for new varieties to try. So I would love to hear from you. What is a must-grow in your garden? So I'm going to go kind of roughly in alphabetical order by category here. So I'm going to start with basil. Later on in this video, I'll have a more broad herbs category, but since I have several varieties of basil that I really like to grow, I figured we'll give that its own category. So basil is, you know, one of my most important annual herbs that I grow in the garden every year. I like to grow a pretty big variety of basils, but since this video is about must-grow varieties, I'm going to focus on the 3 most important varieties of basil that I make a point to grow in my garden every year. The first is the classic Genovese basil. This is probably what you think of when you think of basil. You know, it's got the classic smooth, shiny leaves. It is generally a really high producer. This is what you usually use when you're making a classic pesto or something like that. I find that it is definitely a must-grow for me. It's really versatile. It has the classic basil flavor. Like I said, when you think of basil, that's probably what most people think of. So definitely the classic. It's a classic for a reason. That's a must-grow. I'm going to grow Genovese basil in my garden every year. Now, for a little bit of variety, I also like to grow spicy globe basil. I've also seen spicy bush basil. I think they might be the same variety. I'm actually not 100% sure about that, so that's something that I should look into. I know that they're at least fairly similar. So I really like to grow this variety. It has smaller leaves than the classic Genovese. I find that it is a really beautiful plant. You know, it kind of grows in a mound. The plant overall is smaller than many other basil varieties, but the leaves really do pack a punch. I mean, as you could guess from the name being called spicy basil, I find that it's a stronger basil flavor. And what I like to do most often is to kind of intermingle a variety of basils, and I like to use them together in dishes because I think it creates a more complex basil flavor. So I really like to grow both of those. The third basil variety that I make a point to grow every single year is mammoth basil. You will sometimes see it called lettuce leaf basil. I believe that those two are the same. This is a really large leafed basil variety. It definitely has a more licoricey scent. I'd say probably a little bit more of a licoricey flavor as well. Definitely has a strong basil flavor. I really like it because the leaves are so large that it really goes a long way. I've seen a lot of people will use it to kind of wrap food in. You could use it as like a lettuce leaf wrap, or, just to wrap some appetizers in. Could be really good for that. What I really like to do is I just grow the 3 because I like variety. And what I generally do is I'll just mix them all together and use them all, for the most part, in the same dish. Similarly to what I mentioned with the spicy basil, I think that using all 3 varieties together just really adds to the complexity of the basil flavor. And all 3 of those varieties have been really reliable for me. They all do really well. So I am going to continue growing all of those. Now, one other basil variety that I actually realized I need to add on to this, it's kind of in a separate category, but I decided to include it with the basils, is holy basil. That's not a culinary basil. That's something that you would use medicinally. It's a great tea basil. So I wasn't really sure to include it in the basil category, but I'll just mention it here. I grow that every year as well. You may also see it called tulsi. It is a great adaptogen herb. It has an amazing flavor in tea, and I like to grow that and dry it and then use it for tea all winter long. I find that it's just really soothing, really good for the body, really good for your mood, really good for your nervous system. It's just all around a good go-to medicinal herb. So that one I grow as well. And additionally, all of the basils are really great for pollinators. The first 3 basils that I use for culinary purposes, I try to harvest before they flower. I try to pinch off any flower buds that form, because when flower buds form on those basils, it does change the flavor of the basil. Holy basil is different, and you can go ahead and let that flower. And so the reason I'm mentioning it here is because the holy basil is something that is really popular with all the bees and other pollinators in my yard. I'm going to try my best to stay in alphabetical order here. I have everything written on my list in kind of a random order, so if I jump around a little bit, I might go slightly out of order, so please don't hold that against me if I do. But next we are going to move on to beans. Now, on my must-grow list, I'm only going to mention a couple pole bean varieties. That is not because I don't grow bush beans. I like bush beans and I grow lots of bush beans, but that's kind of what I mentioned at the beginning of the video, where I have lots of different bush bean varieties that I like. I kind of play around with new varieties every year. I'll kind of go back and forth between what I grow, and I like all of them. I don't think I've ever tried a bean variety that I really didn't like. Some are better than others, but I don't really have a bush bean variety that I would say is definitely my must grow. I do, however, have 2 pole bean varieties that I will always grow every year because they're my absolute favorites. The first is the Vortex pole bean. This is a classic green bean. It's a rounded green bean. It can get very long when you let it grow on a trellis when it's supported. Pole bean varieties do need to be given something to climb on. They need to be supported somehow, which is a big differentiation between pole beans and bush beans. I generally prefer pole beans because I find that they're more reliable. They yield more per plant for me. They're easier to harvest, and I can grow them upright, which ends up saving me quite a bit of growing space in my garden. So pole beans are my favorite. I do grow bush beans because they're small plants and they make a great succession crop. They don't take very long to mature, and I can kind of plug them in between other plants. But as I said, pole beans are my favorite. So the Vortex pole bean yields really reliably. In my area, it's a very early yielding bean. So it has a great flavor. It stays tender on the vine a really long time. So I really enjoy that. My other favorite pole bean variety is the rattlesnake pole bean. This is a little bit more of a flattened green bean, and it has purple streaks on it, so it's really beautiful. Of course, the downside is, similarly to beans that are solid purple, when you cook the rattlesnake beans, the purple disappears and it becomes a solid green bean. I tend to slightly undercook my beans, partly because I want to keep that beautiful coloring, and also because I like them to have a little bit of a crispness to them still. So when I cook rattlesnake beans or solid purple beans, even green beans, I tend to undercook them slightly just because I enjoy them better that way. So the rattlesnake bean is also really reliable, really prolific, and I find that growing the 2 varieties together, the Vortex and the rattlesnake, I find that works really well. They complement each other, I think. because the vortex is really early. So that is usually my first yield. Then the rattlesnake catches up when the vortex is kind of in a little bit of a lull, and we get lots of rattlesnake beans. And then when the rattlesnake is kind of in its lull after its first initial harvest, the vortex is putting on, a second harvest of beans. So I find that growing those two varieties, I'm able to kind of stay in green beans the entire frost-free growing season, basically from when they start yielding up until the first frost. Now, I do usually grow every year. I'll probably grow at least 5 varieties of beans, usually more than that. But those two are the ones that never change, that I make a point to grow every year. Next, I am going to mention broccoli. We really love growing broccoli. Homegrown broccoli just has so much of a better flavor, so much of a better texture than store-bought broccoli. And we just love being able to harvest it right in our own yard. So the challenge with growing broccoli or with choosing broccoli varieties is that most of the best broccoli varieties, most of the common broccoli varieties are hybrids. And I find what tends to happen with certain hybrid varieties is that at some point, farms will stop producing them. I'm not sure exactly what the reasoning is. I don't know if it's a money issue. I don't really know exactly the reasoning behind it. But, with heirloom varieties, if that happens, you can just continue growing it yourself. You can continue saving your own seeds. Hybrids don't really work that way because if you save seeds from a hybrid, you don't know exactly what you're going to get. Now, as I said, most broccoli varieties that you'll find available, there are some exceptions, but the majority are hybrid varieties. So my favorite broccoli variety up until a couple years ago was Arcadia. That was far and away the best performing broccoli in my garden. I really enjoyed it, and once I found that variety, I was happy that I didn't have to trial new varieties anymore until a couple years ago when it got discontinued. As I said, I'm not sure the reason behind that. I'm not sure why farmers do that. I don't really know. So a couple years ago, I trialed several new broccoli varieties and found my new go-to, which is Eastern Magic. I've been growing Eastern Magic I think I've grown it 3 years now. And it's done probably not quite as well as Arcadia for me, but close enough that I'm happy with it. I say that it's a good substitute. It's been reliable for me. It yields really well. It yields good sized broccoli heads. It does well for me in my growing conditions. So I would say Eastern Magic is my go-to. Now, every year I do grow a couple other varieties as well to kind of try out new varieties. I'm especially interested in trying out open pollinated varieties, partly because of the issue that I mentioned. I don't want to lose access to my favorite broccoli seeds again. So I've been trialing some open pollinated varieties. But alongside those varieties, every year I have been growing the Eastern Magic and I've been really happy with it. Now, as kind of an aside, this past year for the first time, we tried growing a sprouting broccoli and we really liked it. It was really delicious and tender. So I'm planning to try some new sprouting broccoli varieties this spring. I don't have a go-to to recommend to you for that. But if you have a go-to to recommend to me, I would love to hear sprouting broccoli variety recommendations from you. Next on my list is cucumbers. Now, cucumbers, I mentioned that in many areas of my garden, I try lots of new varieties every year. But I think with cucumbers, I've really settled into my favorites. And unless some new variety comes out, or at least if I discover a variety that's new to me, unless that happens, I don't feel like I really need to try out any new cucumber varieties because we have 3 cucumber varieties. Between those 3, they've met all our needs consistently and they provided everything we need for cucumbers. Really reliable, really delicious. So I'm just going to go through those 3 varieties and just give you some details about each one. The first variety, which is probably, if I had to pick one, I think it would be the silver slicer cucumber. This is a beautiful white cucumber. I really like it for contrast because, most cucumbers are that dark green. So by growing a white cucumber also, it just adds some variety and contrast. I really enjoy it. What I find with the silver slicer cucumber is that it doesn't get bitter in the summer. If you've grown cucumbers before, especially if you live in a warmer climate, a lot of times you'll find throughout the summer, as it gets hotter, especially if there's a lack of rain, cucumbers can tend to get pretty bitter. And the silver slicer, in my experience, I don't think I've ever tried one that was bitter. So I really enjoy it for that reason. It's really reliable. It yields really well. Even in conditions where we haven't had a lot of rain, it still stays nice and sweet. So overall, I really like that one. Now, even though it is called a slicer cucumber, as you can hear in the name, We use it for pickling as well. We eat some fresh cucumbers. My son actually loves eating fresh cucumbers. I'll get to his favorite fresh eating variety in a couple minutes. But for the most part, we don't go through a lot of fresh cucumbers. We'll cut them up in salads or snack on them here and there. But we use most of them as refrigerator pickles. And I find that the silver slicer is great for fresh eating and it's great for refrigerator pickles. So that one's definitely a winner. The second cucumber variety that I want to mention and recommend is the homemade pickles cucumber. This one is a classic green pickling cucumber. It works really well for pickling, obviously, but also works really well for fresh eating. It's a great slicing cucumber too, even though it says pickling in the name. We really enjoy this one. Now, over the years, I have tried a lot of, the classic green pickling cucumbers, and I've had varying degrees of success with them. Homemade pickles has been far and away, for me, the most reliable pickling cucumber. It yields really prolifically, as I said, really reliable. I don't think I've had a bad year with that cucumber since I started growing it. While I would say it probably gets bitter a little more easily than the silver slicer does, it doesn't get bitter that easily in my experience. Now, if you grow that cucumber and you live in a different area of the country, especially if you live somewhere warmer, I would love to hear how it works for you in that area of the country. Does it stay nice and sweet and tender for you as well? Or is that really just me getting the benefit of living in New England? I'm not sure. But either way, that is definitely a great pickling cucumber, and I really recommend that one. The third and final cucumber variety that I'm going to recommend today is definitely a different type of cucumber. This one is the lemon cucumber. It's a round yellow cucumber, so it's not at all what you would expect a cucumber to look like. But they're really fun, These little round yellow cucumbers growing on the vine, they just look a lot different from what you'd expect, and they have a great flavor too. This is my son's favorite cucumber that I mentioned. He just likes to pick them and eat them like an apple, and that's one of his favorite summer snacks. They're really good, really refreshing. I have not tried pickling this cucumber because, I don't know, it just doesn't seem very efficient. It doesn't seem like a cucumber that would be great for pickling. So I think I have heard from some of you who've said you have pickled it before, but honestly, we have the silver slicer cucumber and the homemade pickles cucumber. Those are the long, skinny cucumbers, and those work really well for pickling. They fit in a canning jar much better. So we really enjoy those, and we save the lemon cucumber for snacking. Now, similarly to the others, I have found the lemon cucumber yields really prolifically. This year, we ended up only having one lemon cucumber plant because the rest of the seedlings were eaten by slugs, and we still had more lemon cucumbers than we could keep up with. It just yielded really well. They were really delicious, and similarly to the others I've mentioned, I don't think I've had a bad year with it since I started growing it. So it's a great, reliable go-to option, especially if you're looking for something a little bit different or something for a kid's garden. I find it's a great option. So even though the focus of this video is really on vegetable gardening and my must-grow vegetable varieties, I really don't feel that I can make a complete must-grow variety video without mentioning some of my favorite flowers to include in the vegetable garden. Now, I know that including flowers in the vegetable garden may not necessarily feel like the most practical choice, but it does add so much to the beauty of the garden. In my case, it adds so much to my enjoyment of the garden. It makes me really want to spend more time in the garden. I just feel a lot more sense of connection with the garden. And it does serve a practical purpose too. Having flowers in your vegetable garden attracts pollinators, which is of course going to in turn benefit your vegetables. It also attracts beneficial insects, which can help reduce pest pressure on your plants, making your job as the gardener a little bit easier. They really do serve a variety of practical purposes in the garden as well. So I definitely recommend adding some flowers to your vegetable garden. Now, when you think of flowers for the vegetable garden, probably the most classic flower that you immediately think of is the marigold. Marigolds have been included in vegetable gardens for, years and years, many, many years. So that's because they really do serve such a great purpose in the garden. There are so many varieties of marigolds out there. They tend to be really bright and cheerful and just happy seeming. So my personal favorite variety of marigold in the garden is called the lemon gem marigold. This one, of course, I'm putting it on my must-grow list and sharing it with you. It actually did not do well in my garden for me this year because when I transplanted out my seedlings, they were all eaten by slugs. So I did not actually get to enjoy this marigold in my garden this year, but it is my favorite of the marigolds that I've grown. You know, it's a lot different because even though it is bright and sunny, the way a lot of marigolds are, instead of like the big pom-pom flowers, which those are beautiful too, and I also love those, but this one has a lot more smaller, delicate flowers. It kind of makes a little bit of a mound, and the foliage is just covered with these little yellow blooms. It's really beautiful. So I do definitely recommend that one. This year I am going to be taking precautions in my garden to try to protect those seedlings from the slugs a little bit better. So this year I also tried out the Safari Red Marigold in my garden for the first time. Now, I can't really say that this is a must grow because this is the first year that I've ever grown it, but I did really enjoy it. I found it really beautiful in my garden. So I did want to mention it, even though time will tell if that becomes a must grow in my garden or not, but I did really enjoy it, and I figured I would just give it a little honorable mention here in this video. So another flower that I really like to include in my garden that I find serves so many practical purposes in addition to beauty is alyssum. Now, I like to grow primarily the white alyssum, which is called carpet of snow. I also like to grow the purple alyssum, which is called royal carpet. As you could kind of guess by a flower with the word carpet in its name, it's a fairly low growing plant and it does kind of spread out. And I find that that is a really useful growth habit in the garden because it works as a living mulch. You know, I like to use it on edges of my garden beds. I like to use it anywhere when I don't want soil to be exposed. I like to put it between other plants. You know, it provides a lot of the same benefits as mulch while also attracting beneficial insects at the same time and just adding so much beauty. I really like to use alyssum in my container garden. So on my deck, I grow primarily peppers and tomatoes in pots. And, you know, when you grow in pots, a lot of times there's that bare area of soil exposed. And I like to fill that in with low-growing companion plants as much as I can. And alyssum is one of my favorite choices for that. So I highly recommend growing alyssum in the garden. Another fairly low-growing flower that I like to use along the edge of the garden beds is the nasturtium. Now, you can get nasturtium in a variety of types. There's a more compact mounding variety, and there's also a trailing variety. Or, you know, there's many varieties in those two types. So I like to use both. In different situations, I find that they're both beautiful. So this is one where, you know, I think pretty much any nasturtium is a great choice. A couple of my favorites, if you want to get the mounding variety, the jewel mix is a great option. That includes, you know, bright red, orange, yellow, some of the really bright classic nasturtium colors, and I really enjoy that. So that's a fairly compact mounding variety. For individual varieties, I find that I really like the cherry rose jewel. It's, you know, a deep pink rose color, and I find that to be kind of an unusual color in a nasturtium, so I really enjoy that one. So as far as trailing varieties, you can just get a trailing mix, and there'll be lots of great options in there too. So I really like the nasturtiums because they're just so beautiful and cheerful, and they attract beneficial insects as well. I find that the trailing varieties are great to go on the edge of beds, and they kind of spill over into the walkways. They're really beautiful like that. I like to use them similarly to the alyssum in my container garden as well. Both the mounding varieties and the trailing varieties are really great for putting in pots as companion plants with tomatoes and peppers. I just think that they add a lot to the garden. And with nasturtiums, even the foliage is really beautiful too. It almost looks like little lily pads, and I really enjoy growing them. They are also edible, the leaves and the flowers both. They are pretty spicy, a lot spicier than you think a delicate little flower could be. So it's kind of fun to add a few flowers into your salad just for some variety. So those are just a really beautiful, fun flower to grow. Now, kind of on the opposite end of the scale, I know we were talking about low-growing varieties. There's a couple really tall flowers I like to include in the vegetable garden as well. The first is the zinnia. Zinnias are another classic vegetable garden flower, and that's for a reason. I mean, they're beautiful. They just add so much drama and beauty to the garden. They stand tall. I mean, you can get them in a variety of heights, but they're generally fairly tall. They're very sturdy. You know, they have a presence. And similarly, there's so many varieties that I don't really think you can go wrong. I'll just mention a couple of my favorites here. So first, I really like the Benares giant wine zinnia. That one just has a beautiful, rich, saturated color. It's, you know, a deep, rich red, kind of, you know, a burgundy wine color. like a raspberry color. It's very beautiful. It just has really large flowers. That one's been really reliable for me. It's very beautiful. It has flowered really prolifically for me, so that's one of my favorites. And now I know I mentioned as one of the big selling points of that flower, the rich saturated color. But kind of, and the opposite end of the spectrum, I also really love the Queen Red Lime Zinnia. That one is a lot softer, a lot more muted, almost an antique type of look to the color. I find that one really beautiful in a much subtler way. So I like to grow, I'll probably grow maybe half a dozen or more varieties of zinnia in my garden. But those are, if I had to pick two, I would say those would be my two must grows. So I'll grow those in addition to others, but I'll probably swap out the others here and there, and those I will make a priority to grow every year. Another kind of flower in the garden that's tall with a little bit of presence, but a very different type of personality is Cosmos. Cosmos is tall, but as opposed to the zinnias that kind of stand strong and have their space, the Cosmos just kind of weave kind of gently in amongst other flowers or in amongst other plants in the garden. They're really delicate and feathery and really beautiful, and I really enjoy them. So, similarly to the other ones that I've mentioned, I don't think there is a bad choice with Cosmos. They come in lots of different colors, and you can get lots of different varieties. I would say if I probably had to choose one of my favorite varieties, it would be the Picotee Cosmos. It is really pretty. It's like a white flower with purple streaks. It's got purple edging and just purple, almost like brush strokes on it. It's really beautiful. Now, that being said, we had a very bad slug year, in case you haven't noticed that theme. So the majority of my zinnia seedlings were also eaten by slugs when I first planted them out. So I did not actually get to enjoy any of the Picotee Cosmos this year. I did have some other beautiful Cosmos that I grew. So I'll put in here as an honorable mention the Rubenza Cosmos. This is kind of an unusual color. Cosmos tends to be a little bit more pastel and muted for the most part. There are of course plenty of exceptions. But this one is a deep burgundy color. And the only reason it's an honorable mention is because this is the first year that I've grown it. So I can't speak to its consistency over the years, but I will say I was really happy with it this year. It was, as I said, a deep, rich burgundy color, and we really enjoyed that one. So next, let's talk about herbs in the vegetable garden. I did already kind of give basil its own section. We talked about basil, but there are lots of other herbs that I want to mention too. Now, specifically in this video, I'm going to be focusing on annual herbs. I do also have some perennial herbs that I love, but those I don't start from seed and I don't have to replant them every year. So since this is basically focusing on seeds, buying seeds, getting ready for next year's garden, I'll just mention for perennial herbs, I really love thyme. I have a couple of varieties of thyme. Sage is a great one. Chives are really reliable. I will say rosemary for me is actually an annual. I know for a lot of you, rosemary is probably a perennial. I want to say zone 7 and warmer, rosemary would be a perennial, but I'm in zone 6. So for me, rosemary doesn't usually come back in the spring. So I just go down to my local nursery and I just buy a started seedling of rosemary. I don't try to start that one myself because it's a little bit more challenging. So for me, that is an annual. For most of you, it would be a perennial. So as far as herbs that I start from seed every year, aside from basil, I will say parsley is probably the main culinary herb that I start from seed every year. So I really enjoy parsley. I get the flat leaf parsley. The Italian flat leaf is my go-to. The curly leaf parsley is really beautiful, but I think for me the flat leaf has a little bit better flavor, so that's the kind I get. We also grow calendula every year. That comes in quite a few varieties as well. Because I am growing calendula to use medicinally, I like to get the Resina variety. That variety is supposed to be the highest in the medicinal resins. So that is the variety that I grow. But there are lots of other beautiful varieties of calendula to choose from too. Now, the reason I mentioned calendula here with the herbs instead of with the flowers is, as I said, because I'm growing it for medicinal purposes, but it does also offer actually a lot of the same benefits as the flowers offer as well. Another herb that I like to grow every year from seed is chamomile. Now, chamomile, makes a delicious tea. It also does perform a lot of the same benefits in the garden as the flowers, similarly to the calendula. My favorite variety of chamomile to grow is Zlatilan. Hopefully I pronounced that right. I will put the spelling up here on the screen. I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce it. That is a Polish variety of chamomile, and I have tried growing several different varieties of chamomile in my garden, and Salati Land has by far been the most reliable. It yields consistently for me every year. The flowers are supposed to be slightly larger than the classic German chamomile, so I really love that one. I have had trouble germinating other varieties of chamomile. I know some of you say that it grows like a weed and it's impossible to get rid of, and I would love to have that problem. For me, it's a little more challenging, except with the Salati Land chamomile. That one starts reliably for me every year, so that's the one that I'm going to continue to grow. So next, I want to mention kale. I really enjoy kale in the garden. One of the primary reasons that I really like kale is because it is so cold tolerant. When you live somewhere like I do in New England with a really short growing season, it's so important to really prioritize plants that can grow even when you're not in the frost-free growing season. So kale can grow early in my season and it can grow late in my season. So I really like it because it extends my harvest window. And kale, I'm not a huge fan of raw kale. I don't put it in salads or anything like that, but it is delicious in winter soups. And of course, that is the time when, kale is at its best, when the weather is cool and when you would be wanting to enjoy lots of soup. So I have several varieties of kale that I really like to grow. I'm not really sure what my favorite would be, so I'll just mention my 3 favorites. The first is dazzling blue kale. This is a variety of lacinato kale, and it's just beautiful. It is a really bluish green. This one is more like a strap-like kale. When you go to the grocery store and get kale, mostly what you're going to see is really curly kale, and I like that kind too. But the lacinato kale, which is sometimes also called dinosaur kale, has a very different look to it. The leaves almost look sort of blistered. This one I find, it's a really beautiful bluish green, and it's got purple ribs in the middle. And the color, similarly to most kale varieties, the color intensifies with cold weather. So, that's just a little bonus perk to growing kale. So I enjoy that one. I also really like the red Russian kale. This one's more of a feathery, frilly kale. I find it's really pretty. It's really reliable for me. I find that the first one that I mentioned, the dazzling blue, is not quite as cold tolerant as the others. So when it gets to the end of the season, I find that the red Russian and the third variety that I'm about to mention, which is blue curled Scotch, those 2 varieties tend to be a little more cold tolerant. They go a little bit later into the winter for me. But I really like the variety of growing all 3 kinds. So red Russian, really reliable. Blue curled Scotch is kind of the classic kale. What I mentioned that you find at the grocery store, the really curly leaves, the kind of, I guess that one has a slightly bluish tint to it too. I find that growing all of those together makes for a really beautiful combination, different types of greens, and it adds variety to your garden as it's growing, and it adds variety, of course, to your dinner plate as well. So those are the 3 that I really love growing. It doesn't mean those are the only 3 that I'll grow, of course. I'm sure I'll grow more as well. But those are my 3 must-grow kale recommendations. So next I'm going to mention lettuce. And lettuce, I grow a lot of lettuce, and I like to grow a lot of different varieties of lettuce. This is another area where I think variety is so important, partly because, it makes your salad and your harvest so much more interesting. I mean, who wants to eat the exact same salad every day? Just having variety in color and variety in texture, I think that it just adds a lot more enjoyment. And surprisingly, there is actually variety in lettuce flavor between varieties as well. So growing a big variety I find is really helpful. Also, I find that different lettuce tends to thrive in different conditions. So, for example, the first lettuce that I'm going to mention on my must-grow variety is the black-seeded Simpson. This is a beautiful pale green lettuce. And what I find with this lettuce is that it thrives early in the season. It gets going nice and early. It grows really fast and provides me with a really nice early harvest of lettuce. But this lettuce kind of peters out very early in the season compared to some of my other lettuces. So that's definitely my early lettuce. And then I like to add in other varieties of lettuce that are going to pick up the slack as it gets a little warmer. And that is where my other must-grow varieties come in. So Butter Crunch is my ultimate favorite lettuce. If I had to choose one, doesn't mean I'm not going to grow a dozen varieties every year. But if I had to choose one lettuce, it would probably be Butter Crunch. This is a reliable, delicious lettuce for me. It yields really well. It's beautiful. It keeps its nice, tender, sweet flavor long into the season. Compared to a lot of other varieties, I find that it is fairly bolt resistant. I really love it. Most of the lettuces that I grow, pretty much all of them, I grow as baby greens. So it's a lot different than if you're trying to get a full head of lettuce, just the technique with growing them. But Butter Crunch will provide you with a whole head of lettuce if you grow it that way as well. So the third variety, and this is the last variety that I'm going to mention for lettuce, is called Marvel of Four Seasons. This one, I believe, is related to Butter Crunch. I think it's another butterhead variety. It's green with a little bit of a reddish tinge. It's really beautiful and really, kind of, you're going to sense a theme here. It's really beautiful, it's really reliable, has great flavor. This one lasts really well into the summer, but it is also cold tolerant. You can guess, to earn a name like Marvel of Four Seasons, it has to be able to withstand a variety of weather conditions. So I definitely highly recommend all three of those lettuce varieties. So next I'm going to talk about peas. I really love growing peas. They're delicious. It's one of my family's favorite garden snacks is fresh peas. I also really like that they're cold tolerant. We can plant those really early in the season. Basically, as soon as the ground can be worked, the peas can go out. And it's always very exciting. In my area, it's usually mid-March to early April, depending on the exact weather conditions that year. But basically, as soon as the ground is thawed and ready to be worked, we can go out and plant our peas. So we grow snap pea varieties in my house. I have never tried to grow shelling peas. I think that when you have limited space, which we do have limited space on how much we can actually grow, I think that you get a more efficient use of space if you grow snap peas, where you can eat the whole pod too. So that's all that we grow, and that's what my family is used to eating and prefers. So I grow two varieties pretty much interchangeably. I like the sugar snap pea and the super sugar snap pea. There are some minor differences between the two varieties, but honestly, I think they're pretty interchangeable. There's a little bit of difference as far as maturity date. I think the super sugar snap might be slightly earlier, and I think super sugar snap, I can't remember which one yields more. Honestly, like I said, I grow them interchangeably. I usually plant both of them, and I don't really see a big difference between them. So I would say either of those varieties that you can get are great to grow. So now I am going to mention peppers. Peppers are one of our favorite things that we grow. We grow a lot of varieties of peppers, but for the purposes of this must-grow list, I have pared it down to 5-ish varieties. You'll see what I mean in a minute. So first of all, I'm going to mention a couple jalapeno varieties. We every year grow the early jalapeno. That one tends to be very mild as far as jalapenos go. This year was an exception, or this past year was an exception. It was very hot this year, but that's unusual. Usually that is the more mild of the jalapeno varieties that we grow. We really enjoy that one, and it's very reliable. It yields really well for us. The other jalapeno variety that we grow consistently every year is called the Jalafuego. That one is spicier, and I think it yields slightly later, but it yields just as prolifically. Usually we grow those. I prefer the early jalapeno, and my husband prefers the Jalafuego. He's a little bit more heat tolerant than I am when it comes to spicy peppers. So those are the two we grow every year, and we're always happy with both of those. Now, as far as sweet peppers, we have quite a list of sweet peppers that we like to grow. I'm just going to mention a few here today. The first one I want to mention is the shishito pepper. Shishito peppers are small, kind of wrinkly green peppers. They're really delicious. If you let them stay on the plant long enough, they will ripen to red, but I find that usually I prefer my peppers to be ripe. With shishitos, I do prefer them harvested green. I think the flavor is a little bit better. I think that the pepper walls thin out a little bit when they get red, and I just don't like them as much. They have a better texture and a better flavor when they're green, so that's how we harvest them. We really like to use those by blistering them in a pan, sprinkling some flaky sea salt over them, dipping them in a garlic aioli sauce, something like that. I think that's probably one of the most common ways to eat those peppers. We really enjoy them that way. But I am looking for other suggestions. So if you have other recipes, other ways you like to cook and eat shishitos, please let me know, because as I said, I would love to expand my repertoire of cooking those and find some other really delicious ways to use them as well. Next, I want to mention, and this is where we get to the 5-ish varieties that I was talking about, I'm going to say Corno de Toro peppers here. Now, the reason this is, ish varieties is because these come in multiple colors and I love all of them. For the past few years, I have grown the red and the yellow Corno de Toros. Those are really easy to find. You can find those seeds pretty much anywhere. It's a classic Italian heirloom pepper. They're really good and really delicious. We grow those usually instead of bell peppers because while bell peppers are delicious, they don't tend to yield that much in our experience per plant. Since we have limited space and we don't have enough space to just grow hundreds of bell pepper plants, I like to grow plants that yield a little bit more. In my experience, the Corno de Toros yield a little bit more than the bell peppers for us, so that's why I grow those instead. This past year, I did also try the orange variety and the chocolate variety. Those were new to me. I was really happy with both of them. I can't put them on the must-grow list because I've only grown them once, but I was happy with both of them. Those are both kind of rare, harder to find colors. The red and the yellow, as I said, are pretty easy to find. So I would definitely start with the red and the yellow. If you like them, then it is possible to find the orange and the brown, the orange and the chocolate seeds, but they're not offered by as many companies. So they're a little bit more of a rare specialty pepper. The final pepper variety that I want to mention today is the Lesia pepper. These peppers are delicious. They don't yield quite as much as I would like. I would say they have an okay yield. I would prefer more of a yield, but because the flavor is so good, I'm going to put these on my must-grow list. They're kind of like a bell pepper as far as flavor, but I think they're a little bit sweeter. They have really thick walls. I would say thicker than a bell pepper. They're a little bit smaller than bell peppers in my experience, but we really enjoy them. Even though they don't yield as much as I would like, because they're just so good and the yield is still okay, I'm going to put those on my must-grow list. I say they're definitely give those a try. They're worth growing. So now we come to tomatoes, and I will tell you this is where I really had to pare it down. But I have narrowed it down to 3 cherry tomato varieties and 3 slicer tomato varieties. So I will just run through these and tell you my absolute favorites. First of all, cherry tomatoes. If I had to choose only one variety of cherry tomatoes to grow, I would choose the Sun Gold. This, I really can't say enough good about it. It's pretty much the perfect cherry tomato. It's a beautiful golden orange color. It has a wonderful complex flavor. It's really sweet, but it has a nice tanginess too. So it really just has the perfect flavor. I will say in situations with really heavy rain, they tend to split a little bit, but no more than most other cherry tomatoes do. They are a hybrid, which is, I would say, probably the one real drawback is that because they're a hybrid, I can't reliably save seeds from these and know what I'm going to get. But that being said, I'm happy to buy seeds for these tomatoes and keep growing them every year because I just love them that much. They're really good. If I could only grow one cherry tomato, it would be the Sun Gold. The second cherry tomato variety that I want to mention is the Matt's Wild Cherry. These are small red cherry tomatoes, and I really love them too. They have a really good tomato flavor. You know, a lot of times cherry tomatoes, because they're smaller and because they mature so much more quickly, don't have the same richness of flavor that the big slicer tomatoes have. The Matt's Wild Cherry really does have that rich flavor though. It has like just a classic tomato flavor. It's really good. This is my daughter's favorite cherry tomato. They're small, they have tender skins, they just burst in your mouth and they're so good. The one drawback to these, I would say, is that the tender skin makes them a little bit more prone to cracking than a lot of other tomatoes. So just be aware, if you have heavy rain expected, I would go out and harvest all of the Matt's Wild Cherry tomatoes that are ripe or close to ripe. Honestly, I would do that for probably any tomato. I was going to say cherry tomato, but really any tomato variety. It's helpful to harvest before a heavy rain. So they do crack a little more easily, but the flavor makes up for it, and the plants yield really prolifically. Every year that we grow these, we harvest so many of them, and they're definitely worth growing. The third and final cherry tomato variety that I want to mention is the black cherry tomato. This one is beautiful. This one is a large cherry tomato, definitely larger than the average cherry tomato. I will usually cut these in half in whatever I'm using them in. They're a nice deep purple color. They have, again, similar to the Matt's Wild Cherry, they have that complexity of flavor that you usually just find in larger tomatoes. And this is my son's favorite cherry tomato. So we've got to have all three of these favorites. We all really enjoy all three of them. And if I had to narrow it down to 3 cherry tomatoes, those would be the ones. I am not going to narrow it down to 3. I'll probably grow, 8 to 10 varieties of cherry tomatoes, but those are my must grows. So on to large slicing tomatoes. I have also narrowed this list down to 3 as well. My favorite large slicing tomato is the Cherokee Purple. I find that this one has really rich flavor. It just, it's a classic heirloom tomato. It's just so good. Up until recently, I would have said that this tomato is really reliable and always does well for me. I have struggled a bit with it. This year, I couldn't get the seeds to germinate, so it was probably because my seeds were a little bit old. So that isn't really a fault of the tomato variety. The year before that was the one year I've grown Cherokee Purple where it didn't do well for me, but there were some issues with other similar tomatoes in my garden as well. So I'm thinking it was some sort of weather or environmental factor that caused that type of tomato to not do well. Aside from that one exception, Cherokee Purple has always been really reliable for me. It's been really delicious. I really like the flavor of the dark purple tomatoes. I find that they have a complex flavor and they're just really, really enjoyable. So on the years, aside from that one year, Cherokee Purple yields really well, especially compared to other heirlooms. And tends to be, as far as heirlooms go, fairly disease resistant for me. So I do definitely recommend that one. Probably my new favorite heirloom cherry tomato is the Cindy's West Virginia. I really like this one. I would say the Cherokee Purple still has the edge, but the Cindy's West Virginia is a very good tomato as well. I was recommended to try this tomato by a local gardening friend. And when you get recommendations from local people, definitely give those a little bit more weight because people that are growing in the same conditions as you and have success are likely to be able to recommend varieties that you will also have success with. So the Cindy's West Virginia is a large slicing tomato. It is a nice pink heirloom. I find that it's very meaty, has very few seeds for the size of the tomato. And surprisingly, for being a big slicing heirloom, it has yielded surprisingly early for me. I will continue to grow that one because I've just been, it hits the mark on flavor, earliness, size, yield. It's just been an all-around winner for us, so I really like that one. Another one that is fairly new to me, but I have been having really good results with it, is the Wisconsin 55. This one is it's a smaller tomato, so I would say it would probably still be considered a slicer, but I would say it's a small slicer as opposed to a really large one like the other 2 tomatoes I mentioned. This one yields really prolifically. I have been really impressed with how many tomatoes it's put on, especially really early in the season. I find that the flavor is not as amazing as the other 2 varieties I mentioned, but it does have a really good flavor. Definitely far and away better than anything you'd get from a grocery store tomato. It's still really delicious, and just the fact that it yields so reliably and so prolifically for me, I've really enjoyed that. I will say something to take into account. It has been my experience with the Wisconsin 55. It tends to put on a lot of tomatoes early in the season, but then kind of peter out before a lot of the other tomatoes. So I find it's helpful to pair it with tomatoes that are later maturing varieties, because that way you get the really early yield from the Wisconsin 55, and then when that one's kind of winding down, you're getting yield from your other late maturing varieties as well. So I've been really enjoying that one as well. Just a couple things to be aware of when growing it. So the last category that I want to mention today is zucchini. I would say I have one real favorite zucchini variety. I have grown a variety of different types over the years, and they're all good. But I would say if I had to choose one, my favorite zucchini variety would be the Coca-Cola. That one is really pretty. It's striped light green and dark green. So it definitely gets marks for beauty. I find that it is really reliable. It always yields for me. It always gives me a fairly high yield. It may not be as high yielding as some other zucchini varieties, but honestly, zucchini varieties is very easy for them to be too high yielding. So I've been perfectly happy with the yield that I get from the Coca-Cola. So that would be my favorite zucchini variety that I would mention. So that is my list, my must-grow list. I would love to hear from you guys. What is on your must-grow list? What do you have that kind of overlaps my list, and what do you have that I didn't mention? I would love to hear what grows well for you, and also what area of the country are you in, because that can make a big difference too. So also, if you have any experience growing any of the varieties that I've mentioned, I'd love to hear how well they do for you as well. So I hope you're having a great day. I hope that you are getting into garden season and excited to find some great new varieties for your garden. I know that I am, and I look forward to reading your comments to get some recommendations from you guys too. So I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.